All right, everyone, we might make a start this morning. I know time is very precious for our members in school. So before we do get into our presentation, of course, wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting all across the state and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander members who might be joining us today. So thank you everyone for joining us in week 2 of term 1. We know you are probably still incredibly busy at the moment, so we really do appreciate your time this morning. For those of you who we may not have met, my name's Dee Spink and I'm the Acting Assistant Branch Secretary for Together. On the line, I also have a couple of my colleagues, and if you are participating in our Q&A, you'll probably be interacting with my colleague Tom Ryan as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we do get started. So we will try to keep this session to half an hour. We'll also record it so we can distribute it to the members who weren't able to make it today. If you do have any questions, it's probably easiest if you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. It is just easier for us to capture that, particularly if there's a fair bit going on in the chat. Of course, as always, if you do have any questions that we don't get to in this session, please contact us on schools@together.org.au. So the primary reason for us getting together today is, of course, to talk about the back to school plan, the circumstances, I suppose, around its announcement and then implementation and what's been happening. I think for a lot of our members, it's probably something that's been going on in the background that you may not have had too much oversight over. So we're here today to unpack some of that. And of course, to give you the opportunity to raise concerns around workplace health and safety risks that you might be having in your school right now. So if we just do a little tiny bit of a recap in terms of what's already happened this year. And yes, if you can believe it, we're only into, I think, the 6th week of the year. I'm sure for you all, it's been an incredibly busy start to 2022 as well. So term 1 in, I believe, early January, the Premier announced that they were delaying students returning to schools for a period of 2 weeks. We also know what was something that was really key for our schools-based members in particular was that a number of staff are currently undergoing disciplinary processes as a result of the Chief Health Officer direction regarding mandatory vaccination in high-risk settings. Of course, schools are considered a high-risk setting, and that obviously has workload implications for staff who are vaccinated, who are able to turn up to work. For most of our members, I know you did return to your schools as previously arranged before the Premier's announcement regarding the delay of students returning. And there was probably, it's fair to say, probably pretty mixed bag when it came to principals and regions implementing the work from home arrangements that were supposed to really be happening in those 2 weeks where there weren't students on campuses. Subsequent to that, the Premier on Sunday, the 30th of January, announced the back to school plan. So we'll talk, as I'm sure you all know very well, we'll just very briefly recap on what that actually means in practice. But in terms of the announcement and the implementation, there was no prior consultation with Together before the Premier made that announcement, which was obviously something that is of significant concern to ourselves and some other unions as well. The announcement also meant that there was only a 1-week implementation period for the department to scramble to pull that together. And we know that for a lot of our members, that was a very, very busy period as well. And we understand as well that while it may be subject to change depending on the circumstances of the current COVID outbreak, it should be in place for the first 4 weeks of students returning to school as well. So just very quickly, because I know you all know this, in and out, essentially being in schools yourselves. So the back to school plan, some of the key features of that were there was some provision of rapid antigen tests to schools. Initially, we were advised that was about 5% of the school population, staff and students. I know certainly anecdotally from some of the feedback that we've gotten from members that didn't, certainly for the first week, did not live up to expectations there. The department has also secured priority access at Queensland health testing sites for staff and students. In terms of masks are required to be worn in schools. So for primary school students who aren't covered by the overarching Chief Health Officer mandate regarding masks, they're strongly encouraged to wear them. For high school students, they do have to wear those masks as well, though there is the ability to take masks off when they are sitting at their desks. In terms of other restrictions, limited visitors on school sites, and also the suspension of assemblies, camps, excursions, and other large gatherings. So when the Back to School plan was announced, a summary, I suppose, of some of the key concerns we were receiving from members, a lot of them did have to do with rapid antigen testing. So particularly coming so hot on the heels of the New South Wales and Victorian, and I also believe the ACT announcing their surveillance testing regime in state schools, which was 2 rapid antigen tests per week for the first 4 weeks for staff and students to take before they attended the school. Of course, some of the practicalities around the approach that we've seen here in Queensland. How do we isolate symptomatic students if they're not able to be picked up immediately by their parents? And we know often in cases that can't happen. What about the supply of rapid antigen tests? What if we run out of them? What are parents' expectations around administering rapid antigen tests to students as well? So those were some of the key things that we had coming back to us when the plan was first announced. So clearly, there were a lot of concerns from our members in schools about the Back to School plan, and certainly from an industrial perspective as well. We saw that there were some pretty key things that had been lacking in the process leading up to the announcement of the Back to School plan. And certainly, you know, as we further unpack this with the department, it seemed that some key matters really had not been considered, or certainly not in the way that they really ought to have under both industrial relations legislation and workplace health and safety legislation. So together, in tandem with the United Workers Union, lodged a dispute in the Queensland Industrial Relations Commission the day after the announcement of the Back to School plan. So in that week, there were a number of conferences that were held in the Queensland Industrial Relations Commission to facilitate some further discussion between unions and the department. Those discussions were certainly helpful because we really did manage, we started from a position where the department was essentially insisting that they had consulted with unions around this process, which we certainly have a very different view about what consultation looks like. And it's not simply sharing the information after it's been announced and being told, well, I'm sorry, that's what the Back to School plan is. That's not consultation. That's not, you know, that is certainly not what we believe consultation is. And a number of our union colleagues also share that view as well. So after many hours of discussions in that week, Commissioner Knight issued 4 recommendations, which included that the department consult with unions regarding a risk assessment in relation to the Back to School plan, and also that they must consider a proposal that we have put forward in tandem as well with the United Workers Union around increased access to rapid antigen tests as they become more available across the state. So under the Work Health and Safety Act from 2011, a person conducting a business or undertaking must ensure, so far as is reasonably practical, that the health and safety of other persons is not put at risk from work carried out as part of the conduct of the business or undertaking. Now, clearly, coming back to school in the start of 2020, that's a very different situation that our members and students were finding themselves in than when you left at the end of term 4 in 2021. You know, I'm not telling you, of course, anything that you don't know, but, you know, a gulf of difference really between where you left in 2021 and what you were coming back to in 2022 for a range of reasons, but certainly primarily being the significant increase in the number of Omicron cases that we are seeing on a daily basis. Thankfully, it does seem that the peak has passed, but certainly at the return to, or the nominal return to term 1 in 2022, we were really at the peak there. So that is a very significant workplace health and safety risk in and of itself. So what to do in regards to identifying a risk. And what that usually looks like is performing a risk assessment. So while there's not a specified format, I suppose, that the legislation goes into, what generally happens, certainly in the state government, is that a risk assessment looks like a pretty significant Excel spreadsheet that goes through a range of matters. So obviously identifying the risks, then identifying how likely it is that they'll occur. If they do occur, how severe are the consequences? Then, of course, looking at what are the controls that we already have in place to mitigate the risk, and then what local controls can be put in place to further lessen the risk. And I think when we are talking about a department like education, where of course there are hundreds of work sites being schools across the state that do look very different to each other, that last question is really particularly important, because we know not every school will fit, unfortunately won't fit nice and neatly into a one-size-fits-all box. So when you have identified a risk, there is also the hierarchy of controls to identify how you can make that risk as safe as possible in the workplace. So, of course, the highest and the most preferable of these controls is one that eliminates the hazard entirely. And then you can work through all of those levels of mitigation. The lowest level is essentially personal protective equipment. So, of course, we've all become very well acquainted with PPE over the last 2 years in particular. So that certainly has its place, but really there should be a number of processes that have occurred before you do get to the point where you say, well, make sure you wear a mask. Of course, that's important, but that shouldn't be the only response to the risk of an airborne virus like COVID-19. So through with the Commissioner making recommendations to the department and unions, there have certainly been some movement, particularly last week, in relation to what that looks like with regards to risk assessments. So last week we met with the department along with our comrades in URU, QTU and the QNMU, working around the risk assessment framework that the department has started. We've certainly had some very fulsome discussions around what we think is missing from that risk assessment framework, what we think is potentially misgraded in terms of the likelihood of a risk occurring in a school based on, all the context that we have currently, and certainly identifying some control measures that we think haven't been either identified or given enough emphasis that we think the department has given them at the moment. So we've had some very fulsome and lengthy discussions with the department last week. We are still waiting to hear back from them about adaptations that they will make based on that consultation with ourselves and other unions, and we're continuing to follow up with them in regards to that. However, we also know that, of course, students returned to school last week. So, things did not stop in that process, and it's important that you have the ability on the ground to say, even though I might not have a document from, the department that says XYZ must be done, this isn't necessarily new, or shouldn't certainly be new to those who are on the school ground, in that if you identify a risk, you do need to work through what you can mitigate at the local level to make that risk as safe as possible. And I'm sure we've got many members online who are very well versed with this process and do it on an almost daily basis. So given the importance of ensuring your workplace health and safety at the moment, we did just want to remind people that, of course, you have a right to be consulted locally about workplace health and safety risks. And as we discussed before, all schools are different, and there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach applied here. So the risks, and also how you can mitigate them at a local level, they will be unique. And the people who know that best are the people who are working in your school and in the specific circumstances where the risk might be raised. For instance, we've had a number of our members raise concerns about people using prep labs as thoroughfares. So who knows best how to deal with those? Of course, it's the people who are working in them. And similarly, I'm sure for our admin staff, talking about ventilation in school offices or around how to handle a symptomatic student who turns up and isn't able to be picked up immediately. Likewise, for our schools officers, you'd be pretty well versed in talking about the risks around some of the manual labour that you do as well. So just to reiterate, consultation should certainly be occurring at a local level where you have identified that there is a risk that needs to be addressed. So we do have a form on our website, which we'll redistribute to members, just a very, simple 2-minute form. If you have identified a risk in your workplace that either hasn't been a risk assessment done to actually look at how you might mitigate it, or you are concerned about the level of mitigation that has occurred and you think there are other things that can and should be done to ensure a safe workplace, please let us know and we'll have one of our organisers contact you about how we can process that. So there are a number of ways to escalate those issues. So if you do log one of those risks with us through that form, we'll have an organiser touch base with you to talk about what is the best process in these circumstances as well. Additionally, and for its use as a control measure, rapid antigen tests, of course, have been a really significant part of our discussions with the department through this dispute process as well. So one of the recommendations that Commissioner Knight made was that the department must take all steps to clarify and consider the proposed framework dealing with the provision of RATs in schools as advanced by Together and the United Workers Union. So as hopefully most of our members would be aware, we have been running a petition asking our members to sign a petition about the increased use of RATs, on the increased provision of RATs in schools to our members and other school staff. So while we recognise that, you can't necessarily click your fingers and get 1 million RATs overnight, we also know that this is a short-lived problem and we don't think that the solution should be based on the scarcity of supply at this point early in February, when we know that, potentially just later this month, could be even next week, that supply issue will be much less of an issue. So with that in mind, what we are trying to progress with the department is essentially a 3-tiered process depending on the availability, the genuine availability of rapid antigen tests to be provided to schools. So one of the key concerns about circumstances where you might want to have access to an employer-provided rapid antigen test was particularly in relation to somebody who had been working in close contact or close proximity with somebody who had subsequently tested positive to COVID. So as we understand it, under the current back to school plan and its application of rapid antigen tests, if you were working next to your colleague in the school office, they tested positive to COVID and said, just wanted to let you know, I know we were sitting next to each other yesterday, you wouldn't automatically be provided with a rapid antigen test by your employer unless you were also exhibiting symptoms. So we think that is probably a circumstance, in the more immediate term that should be addressed by an employer-provided rapid antigen test. And of course, once RATs become much more available, also providing them to staff that they can, particularly, I think the next step, particularly if you've got cases in your schools or you have what might be considered an outbreak, a significant number of cases in your schools, that staff should be provided rapid antigen tests to use before they turn up to school. And then when supply is not an issue, essentially give staff a provision of rapid antigen tests to take as is needed in relation to work. So, you might not have cases in your school, or you might have only a few cases in your school that you haven't necessarily been in contact with, but you might wake up and say, well, got a little bit of a scratchy throat, so I'm going to take a rapid antigen test before I turn up to school, potentially infectious. And we think that is, ideally where we want not just our members in schools, but our members across the public service to have access to rapid antigen tests that are provided by their employer to make sure we can try to stop the spread as soon as possible and to not have in as much as we can possibly predict or control, to not have staff turning up to work when they might already be contagious. Of course, rats aren't perfect. We know that there are some issues around using them if you are potentially asymptomatic, but they're also one of the control measures that we do have to work with, and we think that needs to be given a much higher priority, particularly in high-risk settings like schools. And as we are seeing, there are a significant number of students who are testing positive, and there is, I think particularly in looking at state government work sites, there is a really good argument for why schools should be highly prioritised for access to these tests as well. We have had, again, a number of discussions with the department in relation to this. They tell us that they are seeking some higher authority in order to come back to us with an answer around this. Once again, we're following up, and we hope that we'll have some answers soon from the department in relation to this. Of course, as Together is part of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, many of you probably would have received some communication from the union office as well about an ACTU petition around the provision of rapid antigen tests being an employer responsibility. So we are continuing to encourage that this happens as well. I believe that petition might have been delivered yesterday to federal parliament as well. So that probably brings us to the end of the information that we wanted to share today. We know that there is an awful lot going on in schools at the moment, so we will of course continue to be in contact with our members. Please let us know if you do have workplace health and safety risks that are in your school that haven't been resolved. Your workplace health and safety is very important, and it shouldn't be something that we are brushing aside because we've just got work to do. It is really important. And I think as well, important to note, I know we haven't had a number of our members contact us and say, not necessarily a risk, but I do have some concerns around workload, and excessive workload is absolutely a workplace health and safety risk. So if it's because you might have some colleagues who are not at work due to the vaccination policy, or if you have a number of colleagues who are isolating or sick themselves, that excessive workload that is falling back to you is absolutely a workplace health and safety risk. So if that's the case that you find yourself in your schools, please, do feel free, and indeed you should use the workplace health and safety approach around that, because it is a genuine risk to your safety and that of your colleagues in the school as well. We are also resuming visits to schools obviously in a very COVID safe way, and contacting schools beforehand to ensure that that's something that you're comfortable with. If that's something that you'd like a bit more information on, or to have a discussion with us about that, please email us at schools@together.org.au, and one of us will be in touch to talk that through. And of course, and this is very much for a separate piece of discussion, but we just want people to know that your enterprise bargain is up for renegotiation this year. So please do keep an eye out on your emails, and of course through all of the other various forums that you might hear from your union office, whether it's an organiser in your workplace, a phone call from the office, a text, email, etc. It's really exciting that we do get to renegotiate your agreement this year. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us in the school space. So just keep an eye out for that. And if you're already thinking of things that you'd like to see improved, please feel free to get in touch and we can start those discussions as well. But in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a bit more information out for members about how you can get involved, and what the process and what the rest of this year might look like as well. But in the interim, don't hesitate to get in touch with us to discuss that as well. So that is it from me today. So again, I thank you all so much for being part of this today. I can see we've had a few questions and answers, and a bit of engagement in the chat. So please do continue being in touch. And of course, we will get back to members as soon as we hear more from the department about all of the matters that we've discussed today. And yes, look forward to continuing to work with you all hope you're staying safe as much as you possibly can out there, and let us know if there's anything else we can do to be supporting members during this particularly difficult time in the return to school. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and week, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.